Okay, so hello, my name's Matt Brailsford and I'm the Commerce Technical Team Lead at Umbraco. And if you didn't know, yes, Umbraco has a commerce package now. These are just some of the features that Umbraco Commerce offers. So whether that's really nice editor experience, great simple order management interface. We support multiple different markets, discounts, gift cards, things like that. We also have pluggable payment system, dashboards and analytics, email templates, and as you might expect from an Umbraco product, really extendable. So you can customize it and bend it to whatever you need it to be able to do. But the one feature that we're here to talk about today is the new Headless API. So the first question we might have is why? Why have we added a Headless API to Umbraco Commerce? And probably the simplest option that we could give, or explanation we could give, is that, well, the CMS has got a Headless API and some of the other HQ products also do, so it kind of makes sense to do that to Commerce as well. But I think that does a little bit of a disservice to Headless Commerce in general. And there's some really good stats that can help back up how Headless for Commerce is really quite a significant move. So Salesforce do a survey every year where they survey store owners and significant people in the commerce industry. And of the people that they interviewed in the most recent survey, 76% agreed that Headless Commerce allowed them more flexibility to customize their digital experience. On top of that, 72% agreed it increases agility and allows them to make changes faster. So people are seeing that having Headless Commerce gives them much more flexibility and ability to adapt to change, which, given the things that have been going on in the world recently, then being able to move and adapt quite quickly is really quite important. Probably one of the biggest or impressive stats though is this one, which says 80% of people that don't currently use Headless Commerce plan to implement it in the next 2 years. So what's really interesting about that is that these are store owners. So when we talk about Headless, quite often it's quite a technical person's domain, but these are store owners and they realize that Headless gives them an advantage that they don't necessarily get otherwise. So to me that seems more important, that the message of Headless is reaching the actual end users rather than it being just a developer consideration. And so really it's not a question of why. I think it just becomes more of a no-brainer that we really should be having a Headless Commerce API as well. And so, being Umbraco, we do what we usually do. So we implemented our Headless API, got it all ready to push out, and we wrote a blog post that explains exactly what it does, how it works. We did some great documentation that covers all the different endpoints, tells you how to get set up and working with the Headless API, and we also did some Swagger documentation that lets you try them out directly in the browser and see everything working. And so there we go, that's the feature implemented, and surely that's all you need to know. Well, maybe not. For me, whilst we did all these great things, documentation and blog posts, etc., it seemed a little bit anticlimactic. So if it really is so important to store owners and it's got such a potential big impact in the future, then it feels like we should be doing a little bit more to try and inspire how to use that API. Yes, we're giving you the building blocks, but without any inspiration or examples of how it could be used, it proves a little bit more difficult to visualize. So I had a great idea. Why don't we build something that is built how people would build solutions and really showcase how that Headless API works and what we can do with it. Hopefully in doing that it gives a really good example for customers and agencies, and really allows gives inspiration on what is possible. And so this is what we did. But the first thing we did was laid out some goals. First of those is that it had to be real world. We could create a really simple example or demo, but we want to make sure that whatever we produce is really something that resonates with people that would actually implement it. So it needs to work and be built exactly how people would build commerce solutions in an agency setting. It had to use best of breed technology. So again, we could build it relatively easily. We could use things like jQuery and different build it in ways that would be easier but not necessarily the best approaches. So we want to make sure that we're using technology that people and agencies are actually using these days. We want to make sure that it's performant. Again, it could be a relatively easy task just to set up a headless site with that just works, but isn't necessarily something that people would want to deploy. So given that performance is important to agencies and developers, we want to make sure that it's also important in terms of the demo that we produce as well. And finally, we also want to make sure that it showcases as much of Umbraco as possible. So yes, it's fundamentally about commerce, but I think it's going to be possible to showcase all of the different headless features or from other Umbraco products as well. So we can implement those as well and really make it into a great showcase. In terms of features, we're going to want to be able to list our products. We want to be able to do a search as well, so we want to be able to find products across the store. We want to be able to do some filtering, so be able to find products of certain categories, etc. We want it to support multi-variants, so variations is quite a common feature, things like style, colour, size, fit, etc. for products. So we want to make sure Umbraco Commerce is capable of doing all that, so we want to make sure that the demo showcases that as well. Obviously we want to show the checkout flow and how to actually process orders, and as I say, we can showcase other products. It'd be quite nice to show Umbraco Forms as well. So I think there's some good use cases from a store perspective that we can actually make use of Umbraco Forms in that too. And so this is what we created. We created a really nice headless commerce store example, and if you've ever been to swag.umbraco.com, then this will look really familiar. That's on purpose. We were using the Swag store to sell products, so that's a really good real world example, and given that was one of our goals, it kind of makes sense to use something that we're familiar with and that we know actually delivers. So we've based it on that. We have gone a little bit further than what it was on the Swag store, so we've got some extra features just to make sure that we're really showcasing every possibility here. But yeah, really nice clean solution that I think works really well. So if we just take a quick look, this is what we've got. Got a nice product listing where we can see all of our products that are available in the store. We can do searching, so we can find products by keywords or search term. We can also filter products by different categories, and we can also sort the results as well, so we can do price low to high, high to low, etc., and really be able to filter and find the products that we actually want to purchase. We have add to cart features. Here we can see multivariant properties and also a nice implementation point for Umbraco Forms for product notifications. We have the whole cart management interface, so we can add products to the cart, we can change quantities, increase them, decrease, remove from the shopping cart, and we can also get to all of these features as well directly from product pages. So again, we can add products to the cart, and then we also have the checkout flow. So from here we can apply discount codes, and we can actually go through and complete a checkout. So we can capture customer details, and we can choose our delivery methods and our shipping methods. They're all just examples that we've got implemented here. For payment, we can see that we can actually use third-party payment providers. So here we're using Stripe, and the nice feature here is that we're actually using on-site payment capturing. So we'll discuss how this works a little bit later on. This is just a test credit card, so don't worry about seeing the credit card details there. But yeah, so we can see that we can go through the full checkout flow, get a nice confirmation, and then lastly we've also got just some general features as well. So we've got some text pages to be able to have general information, and a more thorough implementation of Umbraco forms as well, so we can have like contact forms, and these are being dynamically rendered based upon the selected form. So that's our store then. That's what we've implemented and built. So let's take a look at how we've done that. So what's the architecture behind all of this? So because we're using APIs, we've got this nice kind of API sandwich. In the back end, we've got our Umbraco instance. We're hosting it on Azure. We've got Umbraco Commerce installed and Umbraco Forms. For this demo, we're just using SQLite to keep it really simple, but that'll probably be backed by a SQL Server database on a real life example. On the front end, we'll take a little bit of a closer look at the technology stack that we're using in a moment, but we're using tools and frameworks that are quite common and new and used quite a lot in agency world, so hopefully something that's quite familiar to people. But in terms of how these are glued together, we've got this nice API layer in the middle, and this is where we're going to be using the Delivery API for content, Storefront API for commerce, and the Forms API for our form inputs. Next, we'll take a look at the site structure, so how we've actually structured our Umbraco instance. And we've got a root node. This is just holding some kind of store-wide settings, so things like the header menu, navigation points, and yeah, just anything that's shared common across the site itself. And then we've got these essentially repositories. So we've got a node that holds a repository of various different content items. So for this, we've got a products container. Inside here, we've got a list of all of our products set up. And on these, they're all pretty much what you might expect. They've got fields that we would need just for presenting and displaying the product data. They can be whatever you want. It's really based upon the design. There's no real requirements being enforced by Umbraco Commerce, so that's quite flexible. The only real things that we need on there from a commerce perspective are these SKU, price fields, and even the stock is potentially optional if you don't need stock management. But all the other properties are completely down to the design. We've also got a pages repository, and this is just for all the supplementary other pages on the site as well. And again, these are quite common in terms of just implement the properties and fields that you need. We've also got this option to select a form that can be displayed beneath the content area of any text page. So that is our site structure. Next thing that we can take a look at is the APIs. So what APIs are we using, and what do they look like, and what can we use them for? So the first one is the content APIs, and if you don't know Umbraco Commerce, then a key thing about Umbraco Commerce is that the product data is actually just Umbraco nodes. What this means from an API perspective is we can use the CMS's own content delivery API to access our product data, and that's exactly what we do. So there's a few endpoints that we can use. So we've got a query endpoint, which allows us to get a list of products. This is where we'll fetch our product list or index page where we've got all the different content, and we can query on that as well. So this is how we'll be able to search and filter, etc. And then we've got an item endpoint, which will fetch just a single individual item. So that's more when you hit the product page directly, and you're just going to fetch one product item back. So that's the endpoint that we'll use for that. We've got some filters and query options that we can apply to these. So we've got a fetch option, and this is kind of setting the context of the query. So this is usually used on the query endpoint, and by default the query endpoint will search the entire content structure, but you can pass this fetch query in and control where that query is going to be performed. So we could just say search the children of a particular node. So that will allow us to really control where that search is going to apply. Next, we've got a filter, so we can filter the results by, for example, a particular content type. But you can also implement and add to these. So we've added on to these as well to be able to do things like filtering by tag. So you can implement your own filters. We've got an expansion property. So this is quite interesting in that it allows us to expand nested properties, so more like content pickers and things like that. And by default, the content delivery API will try and limit the amount of data that it gives back. So it'll be quite opinionated in terms of what it does and doesn't return. But for things like content pickers or grids and things like that, rather than returning nested elements, it will return a reference. But you can use this expand query parameter to ask it to expand those and actually fetch the object. So it'll reduce the number of requests that you might need to make. But it needs to be explicit so that it's not just sending back a lot of data even if you don't necessarily need it. So that's really quite useful query parameter. Next two are, we've got sort and skip and take. So these are quite useful for sorting results and doing pagination and things like that. So quite common kind of query parameters on those API endpoints. We've also got some useful header parameters that we can pass through. So first one is a start item, and this allows you to control when you're making a request. You can pass a path, and by default that will be relative to the route, but by passing a start item you can say the paths need to actually be relevant or relative to this particular item instead. And we've also got an API key endpoint, so this allows us to control or give a level of security to that API and make sure that only people with the relevant API key can actually access those. So they're the content delivery API endpoints. So the next one we've got is our commerce API endpoint. So this is mostly, the one we're going to look at here is more around cart management. So for this we've got a few endpoints we can make use of. We can use the orders endpoint, we can post to that and that will create a new order for us. We can fetch a particular order, so this is useful if you are storing a cookie locally of the current order. If a customer goes away and comes back, then we can use this API to go fetch the order that was stored in the cookie. And we can also perform updates by doing patch requests against a particular order ID as well. At this order level, this is mostly to do with customer details, applying discount codes and updating billing and shipping methods, etc. But the next APIs are for managing items in a particular order. So we've got an ability to post to an order and this will add an item to that order. We've got a patch for a particular item, so this allows us to update quantities and update properties on an order line. And we've also got a delete endpoint which allows us to remove items from our shopping cart. So that really gives you all of the shopping cart functionality, being able to add products, change quantities and remove them, etc. from our shopping cart. We also have some query parameters that are quite useful. So we too have an expansion syntax. Ours is slightly different to the older or the example that I gave for the content delivery API, but the more recent content delivery API updates also have implemented this expansion syntax as well. And this uses square brackets, and what this allows you to do really is go multiple levels deep in your expansion. So if you have an object in an object in an object, if they're just references, then rather than just getting the IDs back, we can say actually expand in a recursive way the properties that we want to pull back. So again, it just gives you the power to control what data is being returned. And another one, or another endpoint that we, or query parameter that we have, is one called fields, and this allows you to do effectively the opposite. It's controlling what is returned, so it'll kind of remove anything that we don't want returned. So a good example for this is, say you've got a shopping cart indicator, a little badge in the top right of your site that just says how many items are in the shopping cart currently. Then you wouldn't want to fetch an entire order payload just to return and display that number. So you can use these fields parameter to say you're just interested in this particular field, so maybe like the total order quantity field on an order, and what that means is it'll only send back that particular field. So rather than sending back an entire object, it just can return a single property, and making that a much lighter payload. Again, this is another thing that was originally just in Commerce, but this has also now been introduced in the Content Delivery API as well, so you can use that there too. The Commerce API has some header parameters that we can make use of as well. So the first one is a store header, and this essentially just sets the context. So everything in Umbraco Commerce is based around a particular store, and so that's when you're adding orders or fetching payment methods, etc. We need to know what store that's for, and so we use this header just to set that particular context, so we know what store everything's related to. And then we also have an API key header that allows us to pass in and or add security, so that you're the only ones that are making the requests against those APIs. So still on the Commerce APIs, but this is more around payment processing. So when it comes to payment processing, there's really three different flavors or three different ways that we can tackle this. The first one is what we would call a redirect approach, and this is generally what we prefer for out-of-the-box payment providers. And this is where on a traditional site you would get to the checkout, fill in all your details. When it's time to take payment, you would redirect to the payment gateway. They would handle taking your credit card payment and then return back to the site. For this flow, how it usually works is your front end with our Headless API needs to ask Umbraco Commerce for a request checkout token. So we need to notify Umbraco Commerce, and Umbraco Commerce needs to know a way of identifying a cart a little bit later on. So this is why we need these tokens. So we'll request a checkout token, that will get returned, and it will also return a redirect URL. You redirect that URL, that is an Umbraco Commerce URL, but that in turn then redirects to the actual payment gateway. When you're at the payment gateway, that'll process your payment. Usually this then involves a webhook back to Umbraco Commerce to tell it that the transaction was successful or unsuccessful, but then it would redirect to a confirmation route or a route or page on your site or application to show the completion of that order. Now this is fine for probably more traditional sites where it's okay to leave the site and come back, whether that's using session cookies or something to remember the order, or if you're using local storage or something like that. But generally, or especially in more application-based solutions, you're not going to want to redirect completely away from the site or application itself. So this is where the second flavor of checkout comes in, and this is still a redirect approach, but we redirect inside either an iframe or a web view or something like that. So it starts out the same. We'll request a checkout token, that gets returned, but rather than redirecting straight to our URL, we'll open the pay URL inside an iframe. That iframe then does the redirect to the payment gateway. It'll show the payment processing form. You'll complete that the same way that you did previously. We'll get a webhook back, but at the point that the payment gateway redirects, rather than redirecting to a page on the site, it'll actually redirect to an Umbraco Commerce endpoint, and those endpoints won't render anything, they'll just be blank and empty. But what it allows you to do on the front end is to monitor that iframe, and if it hits 3 very specific endpoints, which is either confirmed, cancelled or errored, you can check that URL, and if you ever hit one of those, then you can perform the redirect within your application. When that happens, you close the iframe and perform the redirect in your front end code. So this allows us to maintain that ability to do redirect based payment capturing, but without actually physically leaving our application. So the endpoints that we use to do this is there is a checkout endpoint that we can request a token. So we pass it the order ID that we want to check out. This in turn, we also need to pass in a mode header. So what particular flavor of variation of that checkout flow that we want to use. Is it the full redirect or is it that framed redirect? But this will return the token and a redirect URL. And then the redirect URL will use this pay endpoint, passing in the order ID and the token. So that's not an API endpoint, that's more where you would redirect, and that would in turn then do the redirect to the payment gateway. So the final, or the third version or variation of the checkout flow is the one that we actually saw in the demo, where it was staying on site. So it's still inline on the checkout flow, so you never actually leave the site, you never redirected away. The payment form is actually rendered on the site itself. This is probably a lot slicker on the front end, looks cleaner, a nicer solution, but it puts more emphasis on you. So the benefit of the redirect approaches is that all of the security is handled by the payment gateway. But if you do things on site, then you start to need to handle those things yourselves. So that's making sure that you're using SSL certificates, that your site and server is PCI compliant, and all those types of things. That's the main reason that we kind of prefer the redirect approach, but we do understand that this is a nicer and like probably more optimal route of checkout. But as I say, it just means there's a little bit more work for you, the implementer, to do. So in this way, rather than asking for a token, we will notify Umbraco Commerce that we want to initialize checkout. So this basically generates an order number and gets the order ready to be captured. This will return, also Umbraco Commerce will return the order number here, but it'll also return the selected payment provider's settings. So this is quite useful if you've got things like API keys stored in the payment provider settings, and you might need those in order to capture the payment yourself, because whilst using the inline approach, it ultimately becomes your responsibility to capture that payment. So we'll return the settings, you'll have to render a payment capture form, you'll capture the details, you'll send it to the payment gateway through their endpoints, and then whatever notification or confirmation you get back from the payment gateway, then you tell Umbraco Commerce, okay, the payment was successful or not. So you'll call the confirmation endpoint for Umbraco Commerce, let it know that the order's finished and complete, and then you'll confirm and perform a redirect to the confirmation page. So the endpoints that we make use of for this is an initialize endpoint, which just tells Umbraco Commerce that we're about to start a checkout flow, and then the confirmation endpoint is what you will notify Umbraco Commerce when you've got your payment confirmation back. So when you've either captured, or if they've cancelled or errored or something like that, then you can also confirm that as well. So the final API is the Forms API. So as I said, there's a few forms on there that we can make use of, and there's 2 endpoints for this as well. So there's a definitions API, so this allows us to fetch a particular form definition. So if we have a form on, say, the contact page, we need to get the form definition, and that defines and outlines the different fields that we need to display on the front end. So we can use that endpoint to do that. And then we've got a submission endpoint. So this is where we will actually post our form submissions to. This also has an API key endpoint, so this allows us to secure that endpoint. And again, just make sure that we're the only ones that are accessing it. And so that's all the back-end infrastructure, and so that's now time to move on to our front end. As I said earlier, we're making use of a lot of modern technology and for the front end specifically, and it's not for no reason. So we'll get to the reason in a moment, but we want to make sure that we're using cutting edge technology. One of the key reasons is it's the technologies that agencies are using, but there are also some other benefits that we can get to in a second. But in terms of the tech that we're using, we are using Vercel as the front end hosting and also our build pipeline integration. So they've got a continuous integration pipeline. It's got something called an edge runtime, which we can take a look at again in a second, and it also supports incremental builds, which is really quite useful. So that means that we can kind of statically generate a lot of our content, and but then also rebuild some of that content as changes are made later on, rather than having to rebuild an entire website. For our front-end framework, we're using Next, so this allows gives us features like app routing or navigation, automatic metadata and dynamic open graph images, and it also is the APIs that we'll be able to use for fetching and caching any data that we get back from our endpoints. Next is React based, so this is React is giving us our interactivity, so that's our reactive front-end components. It also gives us server rendering of our components, and because we are server rendering, it also gives us our hydration functionality. And then from a CSS perspective, we are using Tailwind. Can be quite opinionated, but we find it's a really quite nice framework. It's utility CSS based and teamed with the ability to do CSS purging, that gives us a real optimal way of doing all of our CSS. And the beauty of all of this is there's not a single drop of jQuery in sight. So how does this all tie together? So the first route is using the CI or continuous integration pipeline, and if we have a Git repository with all our front-end code in it, if we make any changes to that, then Vercel will detect those changes and it will trigger a next build. That next build will compile all of our React components, our Tailwind CSS, and it will connect to our backend APIs and fetch all of our product data, store that in an internal cache, but then generate and build all of our content items, so that our pages, our images, and what it does is pushes these out to what it calls its edge network. And an edge network is essentially a CDN, but the real nice thing about the edge network is that it supports functions. So this allows us to deploy interactivity. Even though it's a static site, we need to be able to do things like order management, adding items to a shopping cart. All of that is dynamic behavior, and we can do that by deploying functions to that edge network. And the real beauty of edge network, because it is effectively a CDN, is no matter what device or no matter where our customers are connecting from, they will always use a network that is closest to them, giving them much more performant websites and making things much faster. But we still know that no matter which endpoint or which edge network they're connected to, we can use those functions to communicate with our back office server and maintain all of that interactivity that we need as well. The second way that we can trigger our front-end build process is with incremental builds, and those are triggered more from our back-end site. So say we log into Umbraco and we create a new product or we add a new page, we want to rebuild the front end, we need it to update with those changes, but we can actually control what exactly gets rebuilt. So this is what incremental builds allows us to do. So if we change a text page, then all we need to do is update the pages on the site. If we change a product, then we can rebuild the product pages and really save on the amount of build time that's going on. So the way that this works is if something changes in Umbraco, this will notify or send a notification to Next through Vercel, which will trigger a next build. This again will do what we saw earlier, rebuild all our React components, our CSS, and refetch the data that it needs to rebuild those pages. It'll then push all of that back out to the Edge network for use on our website. And as I said, this is all really nice tech. You can see the performance. The reasons for the Edge network is really performance, and also because a lot of the features of Next and the other tools that we're using are really heavily optimized out of the box. When we tested the demo store in Lighthouse, we got really fantastic scores on those, and we did have to do some really minor tweaks, but honestly they were really minor. All of these scores were achieved practically out of the box with just a few really simple changes, which would have been a heck of a lot more work to do in a standard kind of project build. So this is really the full reason why we chose all of the tech stack that we did. It gives us that check mark that was on our goal list earlier of real true performance and using modern and best of breed technology. And so yeah, we were just really impressed with that implementation. The performance out of the box was just super impressive. So such a great tech stack to be able to build this demo in. And so that is our demo store. This is available online now, so you can actually go around and play with this. So this is headless-demo.umbraco.com. And yeah, everything that we've seen today you can see online. Give it a try, take it for a spin. You can log into the back end and see how that's built and works together as well. And so there we go. Okay, well, it would be kind of mean just to end it there and just only allow you to poke around the back end. So we also made available all of the source code for this as well. So everything that I've talked about today you can actually go and see for yourselves. So we have an Umbraco Headless demo repo in our GitHub account. On there, this repo has a few branches. There's a backend branch, which is the entire Umbraco instance. So you can literally F5 that and you've got an example of that back office site running. And then we also have a front end branch where you can see again all of the code, all of the source files that we've used for the front end. A little bit trickier to get set up and running because you need to use Vercel, but rest assured there's readmes in there that give you all the instructions on how you can go about doing that. And so there we go. That really is the end of that, and really now it's over to you. So as I said at the beginning, the goal of doing this demo was to try and inspire you to see what is possible with the headless APIs, and hopefully this will give you something that maybe you can use and play around and build something. And I'll just end on one last note, and that is to say, if you do play around with these APIs and you come up with something interesting or fun, then please do consider sharing it. Umbraco is built on a community that loves to share things, and I would just say it doesn't need to be perfect to be something that you can put out there. So maybe you just work on something specific only that you think is useful and it's just barely held together, but the reality is that could be the one link that somebody needs to try and figure out for their particular use case. So no matter what you do, no matter what you come up with, please do share it, and hopefully you can be amazing for do something amazing for somebody else in the community. So there we go. Thank you for your time.